Hi everyone, this is Jed. In this video I'll be chatting a little bit about the topics or concepts of individualism and collectivism and looking at those in a kind of spiritual or metaphysical context. Let's start off just by sort of defining what those terms refer to or represent. With individualism, we look toward really the idea that the individual has the freedom to govern their own life, to exercise their own power and will, to shape their own destiny, to have the freedom to make personal choices and decisions, and so on. So there's the focus on the individual exercising the individual's will. Whereas with collectivism, it looks more toward the society as a whole and what supports the well-being or the common good of the collective being the group. And of course, a group is made up of many different individuals. So as individuals, we always exist, in a sense, within various group or social constructs. So it's a challenge to really balance your individuality with your role as part of something greater than the self, as part of whatever group consciousness or collective you may be looking toward. So in our human society, we think of the collective as the community, so whatever grouping of other people we're a part of, and considering how our individual life and choices interact with the greater whole. Since we don't exist as an island per se, whatever we're doing has an impact. It affects those around us, and we can't really separate the individual self from the collective. They are intertwined in that sense. So of course that results in sort of this constant wrestling with how much individual freedom is the collective willing to allow, since the individual has the potential to in some manner disrupt the well-being of the collective, to interfere with the wishes, the interests, or intentions of the group, of the collective. So we see kind of a pendulum swing back and forth in civilizations where it may shift in one direction or another, shifting toward focusing more on the individuality, individual freedom, versus focusing more on imposing some type of external controls or authority to in some way guide or direct the individuals to conform to whatever is perceived to be in the best interests or common good for the group or collective. So that's where you have lots of political debates. You have people speaking about things like socialism and communism and libertarianism and capitalism and all these different philosophies that tend to prioritize one aspect relative to the others. So some philosophies prioritize individualism more, others prioritize collectivism more. And if we look at history and the nature of human experience, we'll often find that when one absolutist type of philosophy is implemented it tends to create challenges that trigger a reaction, a polarization toward the opposite polarity of philosophy. So, for example, in a society where there's a lot of control imposed, you'll often see some type of revolt, some effort by people to break away from that, to develop a society where they feel they have more individualism. One historical example of that would be in religion, where you have Reformation efforts, where there's a centralized church authority, and people who don't want to be confined or constricted to that particular doctrine or dogma break away, and they create something that, from their perspective at least, is designed to allow more freedom of thought, more individual conceptualization of their spiritual beliefs. Now, I feel it's important for each of us to recognize the hazards or dangers, in a sense, of going toward any polarized extreme or the other in the context of individualism and collectivism. So there are actually potential benefits and risks of either of those focuses or approaches. With individualism, if people are very individualistic and functioning without adequate concern for the collective, then they often will do things that end up harming others and triggering a backlash, triggering the collective to want to protect itself and start to impose greater controls or restrictions on individual expression. However, if there's too much collective focus, if there's not enough allowance for individual expression and exploration, then there's a stagnation that occurs, a rigidity or lack of evolution, since it's the individuals who kind of stretch or go beyond the norm, who in some way function outside of the confines or limitations that a collective may have been accustomed to, who can help, in a sense, allow the collective to evolve. If you think of the idea of genetic mutations, a species that's not able to mutate is not able to adapt and change and evolve according to the circumstances that may be present in the environment. So there are times where we need to be pushed outside of the norms of the collective, where the individual, by not conforming, actually contributes to the well-being of the collective, since it creates something new or different that allows for an expansion of the potential of the collective. So the collective ultimately needs some degree of individuality to be present in order for the collective to maintain its well-being, its potential for growth, for evolution. So this is a dynamic to explore, this kind of interplay between focusing on the well-being or common good versus focusing on freedom and individuality. Sometimes they'll appear to be in conflict with one another, while other times they'll actually appear to be supporting one another. So it's hard to stick to a really rigid way of looking at these things. If we become too absolutist about any philosophy, we start to narrow our perspective. We're not really seeing things from a more expansive or holistic type of view. Another consideration, especially if we think in metaphysical terms, is that creation itself is actually a dynamic of the individual and the collective. There's the creative intelligence that we might call God that originates as a unified consciousness, and then that consciousness, for the purpose of creation and experience, creates a sense of fragmentation, of breaking apart into unique, distinct, individuated selves that function in relation to one another. And then those individual selves get to play their role in the process of creation, or co-creation, we could say. But in doing so, they're in a sense limited by certain boundaries or constructs that the original creator behind them, behind their existence, has established in some sense. So if we think about our human lives, we don't have total creative power over everything that's going on in our life, that's happening in this external environment around us. We're contributing in a small way, in a certain sense, to what's being manifested and created. But our own personal, individual will and desires aren't creating everything out there, so to speak. We are creating our own personal, subjective experience with everything that's around us. But everything that exists in this reality is, in a sense, a co-creation. Each of us, plus all the other beings that are participating in creation, are co-creating that reality. So your personal will isn't overriding the will of all the people in your community, of all the other life forms on the planet. You're not able to override the consciousness of the planet, the solar system, the galaxy, etc. So we are individuated forms of consciousness interacting within a greater collective. And the collective really has more energy or more power that it can impose or exercise. And therefore, the collective can govern or limit the free will of the individual. For this reason, it's often common in spiritual practices to seek to align our own individual will or our own individual consciousness with a greater consciousness so that we're in harmony with that. So if there's a particular intention or will for our soul or for the planet, for the cosmos, then we could seek to be more in harmony or alignment with that greater, you could call it a higher will or collective will. And in theory, that would enable our personal experience to become more harmonious and more fluid in a sense, where we're not functioning in conflict with or resistance to that higher intelligence. So to create kind of a more easy, more graceful personal path. So this is something that we can each meditate on. In the healing arts, in particular in the practice of Reiki, which I've, been practicing well over 2 decades now, there's often a statement used to support or help facilitate the highest good for the client you're working with and, in a sense, for all of creation. So my invitation to each of you is to consider how individualism or individuality and a greater consciousness or collective expression of consciousness can function in harmony with one another, can both serve the well-being and interest of each other, since ultimately the individual and the collective are not separate. They're really different facets or aspects of the same creative process and exploration. One thing to consider in terms of when we look at that apparent conflict between individuality and collectivism, people sometimes use the word anarchy or anarchism to refer to a lack of external authority imposing itself on the individual. So some type of system where there's, theoretically at least, absolute freedom of the individual. And when people think of that, they often think of chaos, of that leading to a state of conflict and violence and really no coordination in society. However, it really depends on the state of consciousness of all the individuals who are involved. So if individuals are functioning from a state or level of consciousness where they're very much attuned to the collective, to the environment and community around them, and a concern for the well-being of that collective, not seeing themselves as having to be in conflict with the collective, but actually functioning to serve the well-being of both, then you can have a relatively peaceful or harmonious anarchic type of society. So when we're self-governing, if we're doing that from a state of expanded consciousness, then all those selves can govern themselves in a way that helps things function smoothly, efficiently, that enables the collective to be supported and nurtured as well. Now, if individuals are not functioning at that level, and they're functioning from more of, we could call it a fear-based level or ego-based level, a primal survival orientation, where they're not able to attune to others, to consider how they interact with and affect or influence the well-being of those around them, then of course it can lead to that more chaotic vision of things. So it really depends on each of us as individuals to develop our consciousness to be able to support both the individual will and well-being and the greater intention or collective consciousness. It's not easy to put all this into words, into human language, to envision how all these things can function. While I feel it's very valuable to make this effort to consider these ideas and to do our best in our own individual way to grow our consciousness and to align our consciousness with the well-being of the collective along with the well-being or the potential of our own individual evolution, to see those as potentially supporting one another rather than feeling that we're in some way clashing or conflicting when we consider a philosophy of individualism or one of collectivism. I appreciate each of you for taking the time, for viewing this video and exploring these ideas. For those that are interested in topics like spirituality, holistic health, and personal growth, you are invited to view some of my other videos on these topics. And for those interested in what I provide or facilitate as a healing professional, you can visit my website at phinsights.com. That's phinsights.com. So I'd like to wish everyone a wonderful day. Namaste.